Hello, my name is Janine Turner, and I am founder of Constituting America. Welcome to our annual academic study, History Holds the Key to the Future, or as Shakespeare said, what's past is prologue. This year's study is entitled The Genius of America, A Journey into Our Republic, a study on Alexis De Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Only a newspaper can come to deposit the same thought in 1,000 minds at the same time. Alexis de Tocqueville. This essay is entitled Connection Between Associations and Newspapers, Volume 2, Part 2, Chapter 6. Guest essayist is John Bicknell. And it's pages 493 through 495 of Democracy in America, the University of Chicago Press, the first edition translated by Harvey, Mansfield, and Delba, Winthrop. On the relations between associations and newspapers. Modern readers who turn to any number of media options other than newspapers might find de Tocqueville's focus on print to be archaic, but his thesis remains valid today when applied to those alternative forms of news and information gathering. Quote, only a newspaper can come to deposit the same thought in 1,000 minds at the same moment, end quote. He wrote in the 1830s. He wrote at the very moment when newspapers were beginning to boom, and just before the revolution in communication and transportation that accompanied the invention of the telegraph and the spread of railroads. De Tocqueville tied the importance of newspapers in developing and fostering associations to his work's main focus, the centrality of civil society to American culture. Where groups of ordinary but active citizens matter more than elites, their ability to communicate with each other in dependable forms with regular publication and an agreed-upon idiom were essential. For him, this was not simply a matter of politics, of being a critical voice in defending the freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution. Newspapers, de Tocqueville asserted, quote, maintain civilization, end quote. In the classic construction, newspapers have never been very good at telling people what to think, but have been quite successful in telling people what to think about. Quote, if there were no newspapers, he wrote, there would almost never be common action, end quote. In the 1830s, and indeed until the birth of the yellow press in the later half of the 19th century, newspapers were typically party organs. Again, de Tocqueville was writing at the opportune time, just as the second party system featuring the Jacksonian Democrats and the Whigs was forming. Newspapers chose sides and reported the news from the point of view of their sponsor party. One could argue that we have come full circle on that account, with blatantly partisan media choosing sides rather than straining to maintain objectivity. What differentiated the United States from the aristocratic countries of Europe was a level of participation in public affairs by the common man. Quote, the principal citizens who live in an aristocratic country perceive each other from afar, he wrote. And if they want to unite their forces, they move toward one another, carrying along a multitude in their train, end quote. Not so in America. Common people, quote, all being very small and lost in the crowd, end quote, do not all know or know of each other as the elites usually do. They have to seek each other out. The avenue for doing so was the newspaper. Today, that purpose is often better served by social media than by newspapers or television news, but the process described by de Tocqueville almost 200 years ago remains much the same, even as the medium has changed. Quote, up comes a newspaper that exposes to their view the sentiment or the idea that had been presented to each of them simultaneously but separately, he wrote. All are immediately directed toward that light, and those wandering spirits who had long sought each other in the shadows finally meet each other and unite, end quote. It is perhaps a romanticized view of X, Facebook, or TikTok to think of users as wandering spirits seeking each other in the shadows before finally uniting. But in essence, that's what's happening on a much grander scale, just as it did with party-affiliated newspapers in the 1830s. And scale matters. Quote, in democratic nations, it is always necessary that those associating must be very numerous in order that the association may have some power, end quote, De Tocqueville wrote. When historians write about the, quote, revolution, end quote, in communication and transportation, they are not overstating the case. Until the 1840s, time and distance restricted the ability of Americans to travel and communicate quickly with anyone more than a dozen miles away. The invention of the telegraph in 1844 and the rapid expansion of railroads, track mileage soared from 1,000 miles in 1835 to 3,000 miles in 1840 to 30,000 miles in 1860, altered the landscape in ways de Tocqueville and few of his contemporaries could imagine. The telegraph spread news almost instantaneously. Railroads carried ever more newspapers, from 900 in 1830 to 3,000 in 1860, into every corner of the country. Suddenly, what happened in New York or Washington could be read about within days in virtually every small town east of the Mississippi. This resulted in a better informed populace and provided greater opportunities for like-minded citizens to communicate and organize. But it also began the process of nationalizing the media, a trend that continues today. The concentration of information resources in Washington and New York divorced large segments of the population from the unifying spirit of mass media, creating the need for a social media that gathers de Tocqueville's, quote, wandering spirits, end quote, in search of each other. This essay was written by John Bicknell. John Bicknell was a journalist for 30 years as a reporter, editor, columnist, and opinion writer in Florida and Washington, D.C. He is the author of 3 books, America 1844, Religious Fervor, Westward Expansion, and The Presidential Election That Transformed the Nation, Lincoln's Pathfinder, John C. Fremont, and the Violent Election of 1856, and The Pathfinder and the President, John C. Fremont, Abraham Lincoln, and the Battle for Emancipation, and was a senior editor of the 2016, 2018, 2020, and 2022 editions of the Almanac of America Politics.